Have you ever felt like you were trapped in a nightmare, but what if that nightmare was real? This chilling true crime story takes you into the depths of terror, where escape seems impossible and the darkness never lets go. Will Emily survive the horrifying truth of her past, or is she doomed to face the shadows forever? Stay with us as the terrifying twists unravel and the line between reality and nightmare blurs. You won't believe what happens next. The rain pounded against the cracked windshield. Faint streaks of water trickled down like tears. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. The narrow road ahead seemed endless, swallowed by darkness. She adjusted the rear-view mirror. Nothing but the hollow blackness stared back. Her breath quickened, fogging the glass. A crackling voice emerged from the car's radio. It was faint at first, almost static. Then, clearer, louder. Case #35 unsolved, brutal. Emily froze. The words pierced the silence like a blade. She hadn't touched the radio. The knob spun on its own. The voice grew colder. They never found him. They never found you. A sharp chill crept down her spine. She turned the dial frantically, but it wouldn't stop. Then, a sudden jolt. The car skidded to a halt. Her heart slammed in her chest. The headlights illuminated a figure. A man stood in the middle of the road, motionless, his face hidden beneath the brim of a soaked hat. The rain seemed to avoid him, like he didn't belong. Emily's fingers hovered over the door lock. The figure stepped closer. His boots crunched against the gravel, unnervingly slow. Closer. Each step echoed louder than the last. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled for her phone. No signal. The man raised his head. His eyes gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the dim light. He didn't blink. The radio hissed again. Case #35 The Woods. Emily's stomach churned. The woods surrounded the road on both sides, dense and suffocating. She stared at the man. He pointed toward the trees. Silent. Demanding. A choice she didn't want to make. Stay in the car and risk his wrath. Or step into the forest, where the darkness seemed alive. The voice returned more sinister. They never escaped the woods. Her pulse roared in her ears. Emily reached for the car door handle. Her heart screamed not to open it. But she did. The icy wind clawed at her skin. The man was gone. Only his shadow lingered, stretching unnaturally across the asphalt. The woods whispered her name. It sounded like her own voice. Faint. Desperate. Emily took one trembling step toward the trees. The trees loomed tall, their skeletal branches clawing at the starless sky. Emily's foot sank into the mud with a squelch. The air was thick, suffocating, like it carried secrets too heavy to bear. Each step felt wrong, as if the ground itself resisted her movement. Leaves rustled above, though no wind blew. A low hum vibrated through the forest, faint but growing. Her breath fogged in the cold, each exhale trembling with fear. She turned back toward the road. It was gone. Nothing but endless trees surrounded her now. Her pulse quickened. The hum morphed into faint whispers. Indistinct words. But they sounded like her own voice, calling her name. Faint, then louder. Emily, Emily. Her hands shook as she held her phone aloft, its weak flashlight trembling with her. A tree trunk ahead bore deep gashes, carved crudely into its bark. She leaned closer, the light flickering. Numbers. Carved violently, haphazardly. 35. The whispers grew louder, overlapping. She spun around. Nothing. No movement, no man, no shadow. But she felt it. Eyes on her. Watching. She stumbled forward, the whispers growing sharper. Clearer. It wasn't her name anymore. It was crying. A soft, pitiful wail that echoed through the trees. Her legs moved on their own, dragging her toward the sound. Ahead, the forest opened into a small clearing. The moonlight, pale and cruel, bathed the scene in unnatural light. There, at the center, lay something wrapped in plastic. A tarp, dark and slick, glistening with rain. The crying stopped. Silence. It stretched so thin it screamed in her ears. Her breath hitched as she knelt beside the tarp. Her hands hovered over the edge, fingers trembling. The whispers returned, louder now, frenzied. They pushed her. Open it. Her heart pounded as she gripped the tarp's edge. With one swift pull, she tore it open and froze. The face staring back at her was her own. Emily staggered back, her hands flying to her mouth. Her own lifeless eyes stared up at her from beneath the plastic. The reflection of her face was pale, bloodless, with a jagged wound slashed across her throat. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar. They weren't just in her head anymore. They surrounded her. The trees seemed to shudder with their weight. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, sending her sprawling onto the damp ground. Mud smeared her hands as she tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt weak, useless. Her phone slipped from her grasp and landed face up in the dirt. The screen flickered to life. A video began to play. It was her, walking down this same road, her car in the distance. But something was wrong. The timestamp read 3 hours ago. She was alone in the footage, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Then, in the corner of the screen, a shadow emerged. It grew larger, closer, until it enveloped her. The screen went black. A faint sob escaped her lips. She grabbed the phone and turned wildly, searching the clearing. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice breaking. Only silence answered her. She looked down again at the body, her body. The plastic wrapping was gone. The corpse was gone. The ground beneath where it lay was now scorched, blackened as if by fire. The whispers returned, soft and deliberate. "Run, Emily." Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was her own. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the brittle leaves. She spun around, the beam of her phone trembling in the darkness. Nothing but trees. The screen went black. A faint sob escaped her lips. She grabbed the phone and turned wildly, searching the clearing. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice breaking. Only silence answered her. She looked down again at the body, her body. The plastic wrapping was gone. The corpse was gone. The ground beneath where it lay was now scorched, blackened as if by fire. The whispers returned, soft and deliberate. "Run, Emily." Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was her own. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the brittle leaves. She spun around, the beam of her phone trembling in the darkness. Nothing but trees. But the sound didn't stop. Closer. Louder. She turned and ran, her legs pumping through the forest, branches clawing at her skin. The whispers followed her, taunting her, repeating her name over and over. The sound of the footsteps matched hers, impossibly close. And then ahead she saw it. Her car, parked where she had left it, headlights cutting through the fog. Relief surged through her chest as she sprinted toward it. She threw open the door and collapsed inside. She fumbled for the keys, her fingers shaking, and jammed them into the ignition. The engine sputtered and roared to life. She slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, but just as the tires hit the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, sitting in the back seat, was the man in the hat, smiling. Emily's scream tore through the car, raw and primal. Her hands clenched the steering wheel, swerving wildly as the vehicle skidded on the slick road. The man's smile stretched unnaturally wide, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "Keep driving," he said, his voice low, a gravelly whisper that sliced through her panic. She couldn't speak. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps as her foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The car roared forward, the road a blur beneath the headlights. Faster, he murmured, leaning forward. She felt his icy breath on the back of her neck. Her vision blurred with tears, the edges of the world closing in. "Who are you?" she choked out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a gloved hand and pointed. Ahead, the road disappeared into darkness. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "There's nothing there." But the car didn't stop. It moved on its own, her foot no longer controlling the pedal. The steering wheel twisted under her hands, dragging the car into the void. The headlights flickered, dimming with each passing second. She reached for the door handle, desperation clawing at her chest. But it wouldn't budge. Her reflection in the rear-view mirror stared back at her. But it wasn't her. The face in the mirror was distorted, twisted, with sunken eyes and a grotesque grin. She turned away, clenching her eyes shut, willing it all to disappear. When she opened them, the man was gone. But the car kept driving, hurtling into nothingness. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping like a cacophony of voices. They filled her head, drowning out her thoughts. Case #35 unfinished unclaimed. The dashboard lights flickered erratically. The radio crackled back to life. A single voice spoke, clear and cold. "Emily, do you know how this ends?" Her hands tightened on the wheel as the car began to slow. The darkness ahead peeled away, revealing a clearing bathed in pale, unearthly light. At the center stood her car. Her empty car. The door was open, rain pooling inside, and the driver's seat soaked. Emily's heart stopped. It was her car, and she was walking toward it. Her duplicate turned, locking eyes with her. Then smiled. A jagged, blood-streaked smile. Emily's breath hitched as the bloodied version of herself stepped closer. The smile was wrong. Too wide, too sharp. It was a predator's grin, carved into her own face. "Stay back," Emily croaked, her voice trembling. Her duplicate tilted its head, mocking her fear. Rain dripped from its soaked hair, mingling with the streaks of crimson on its pale skin. "You can't run," it said, the voice echoing strangely. It wasn't just her voice. It was layered with whispers, overlapping and endless. Emily scrambled back into her seat, slamming the car door shut. Her trembling hand reached for the ignition again. The engine sputtered, coughing weakly before dying completely. "No, no, no," she whimpered, turning the key over and over. Outside, her duplicate was closer now, its hollow eyes locked on hers. The figure placed a hand on the hood of the car, fingers dragging slowly across the metal. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, amplified and distorted. Emily's ears rang, her vision blurring with tears. The whispers in her head surged again, louder, more insistent. "Let her in. Take her place. You've already lost." She clutched the steering wheel, shaking her head violently. "This isn't real," she muttered, her voice cracking. "This isn't happening." The figure moved to her window, pressing its face against the glass. Their noses almost touched, separated by a thin pane of rain-slicked glass. Its eyes bore into hers, empty and endless. Then, it raised its hand and tapped the window. Once. Twice. Each tap sent a jolt through Emily's chest. The glass began to crack, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact. "Don't do this," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. Her duplicate's grin widened, splitting impossibly far, until it reached the edges of its face. With a deafening shatter, the window gave way. Glass exploded inward, slicing through the air. Emily screamed, shielding her face with her arms. When she lowered them, her duplicate was inside. It leaned close, its breath cold against her cheek. "You can't escape yourself," it hissed. Emily's world spun as the figure grabbed her arm, its grip like ice. Pain seared through her as the whispers consumed her mind. She tried to fight, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Her vision darkened, the edges fading to black. The last thing she saw was her own face staring back at her, smiling. And then everything went silent. Emily woke with a jolt, gasping for air. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her skin slick with cold sweat. The car was still, silent. The rain had stopped, leaving the windshield streaked with water and grime. For a moment, she thought it was over, a nightmare, a cruel trick of her mind. But then, she saw her reflection in the rearview mirror. It wasn't her. The face staring back was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to stretch forever. Her breath hitched as she turned, hoping, praying, that it was just a trick of the light. But there was no one in the back seat. Only emptiness. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle. It moved. On its own. The door clicked open with a slow, deliberate groan. A cold wind swept in, carrying with it a faint whisper. Emily? Her name, soft and beckoning, like a lullaby sung by a ghost. She stepped out, her legs weak beneath her. The forest was gone. In its place was a long, endless field bathed in silver moonlight. The air felt heavy, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Ahead, in the middle of the field, she saw it. A single figure, standing motionless. It was her. Again. The duplicate turned slowly, its movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. It raised one hand and pointed. Behind her. Emily didn't want to turn, but her body betrayed her. She turned and froze. There was another figure, and another, and another. Dozens of them, identical to her, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were twisted, each one more grotesque than the last. Some smiled, their mouths too wide. Others wept, silent tears streaming down hollow cheeks. They began to move, closing in on her, their steps perfectly synchronized. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. Emily, Emily. She backed away, her hands clamping over her ears. Stop, she screamed, but her voice was drowned out. The first duplicate stepped forward, close enough that she could feel its cold breath. It tilted its head, its lifeless eyes locking onto hers. You were never meant to leave, it said, its voice splitting into many. You are one of us now. The others surged forward, their hands outstretched, pulling her into their midst. Her screams were swallowed by the night. And then there was only silence. Emily's eyes snapped open to darkness. She was lying on cold, damp ground, her body aching as if she'd been crushed. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of earth and decay. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt leaden, like they didn't belong to her anymore. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely cutting through the gloom. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, drawing her gaze. Where am I? She whispered, her voice hoarse and raw. The light brightened for a moment, illuminating the ground around her. She gasped. The earth was littered with fragments of mirrors, each one cracked and stained. She reached out to touch one, her fingers trembling. The surface was cold, slick with condensation. But when she looked into it, she saw not her reflection, but her duplicates. All of them. Hundreds of distorted faces stared back, their eyes wide and accusing. The whispers returned, soft and insistent. You ran, you hid, you failed. She dropped the shard, her breath hitching as it shattered further. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The shadows moved, twisting unnaturally, slithering toward her like living things. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her knees shaking. The light called to her, beckoning with an unnatural pull. She stumbled forward, each step an effort as the ground seemed to shift beneath her. The shadows clawed at her heels, whispering her name in voices that weren't hers. She reached the source of the light, a massive, cracked mirror standing upright in the middle of the clearing. Its surface shimmered, alive with motion. Faces swirled within it, pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. Her own face appeared, calm and expressionless. It spoke, but the words came from behind her. "You've always been here." Emily spun around. The man in the hat stood there, his face hidden in the shadows of the brim. But his voice was hers. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the fragments of mirrors. "This is where you belong," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Emily backed away, her body trembling. "No, I'm not like them. I'm not." "You already are," he interrupted. He raised a gloved hand and pointed at the mirror. "Look." She turned reluctantly, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her anymore. It was one of them. A grotesque, hollow-eyed version with a wide, twisted grin. The light flickered violently as the whispers swelled to a roar. The ground beneath her feet crumbled, and she felt herself falling. Falling into the mirror. Into herself. And then, nothing. Emily woke to an unnatural stillness. No rain, no whispers, no sound at all. She lay in a dimly lit room, the air heavy and stale. The walls were smooth, featureless, and gray, stretching endlessly in all directions. There was no door, no windows, just her, sitting in the center of the void. Her head throbbed, a dull, rhythmic pain that pulsed with every beat of her heart. She touched her face, half expecting it to feel unfamiliar, but it was her own. Or so it seemed. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It echoed in the room, directionless and maddening. "Hello," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. Then came footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just beyond her reach. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. No answer. Instead, a mirror appeared before her, materializing as if it had always been there. The surface was smooth and flawless, reflecting her perfectly. She stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. Her reflection didn't respond. It moved. It tilted its head, studying her with an unsettling calm. "Do you see it now?" it asked, its voice identical to hers, but layered with a strange resonance. Emily stumbled back, shaking her head. "This isn't real. None of this is real." The reflection smirked, its eyes narrowing. "Real is what you make it," it said. It reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass. The surface rippled like water, the motion drawing her in. Against her will, Emily stepped closer, her body moving as if controlled by an unseen force. The reflection's smirk widened into that familiar, grotesque grin. "You've been running from the truth," it said. "And now, there's nowhere left to hide." The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, shards flying in all directions. Emily shielded her face, her pulse racing. When she looked again, the room was gone. She was back in the woods, standing in the clearing where it had all begun. The tarp lay before her, still and silent. But this time, when she pulled it back, the body underneath wasn't her. It was the man in the hat. His face was blank, his eyes open and staring into nothing. Emily stumbled back, her breaths ragged and shallow. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. They seemed to come from within her. And as she looked down at her hands, pale and trembling, she saw the truth. Her fingers were stained with blood. Her own voice echoed in her mind. "You never escaped the woods." The world began to blur, dissolving into darkness. And somewhere in the distance, a voice called her name. Not in a whisper, but in a scream. The darkness enveloped her, pulling her into its depths. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tight with terror. But just as the void seemed to swallow her whole, she felt the ground beneath her shift. The weight of something pressing down, familiar yet terrifying. She opened her eyes, her vision slowly adjusting to the dim light. She was back in the forest, standing in the same clearing. The same stillness. The same echoes of her own name, barely a whisper, but insistent. The body of the man in the hat lay sprawled before her, lifeless and cold. His face was slack, his eyes staring into the nothingness. Her hand trembled as it hovered over her own blood-stained skin. Was this her doing? Was she the one who? The question gnawed at her, but the answer came in the form of another reflection. In the pool of blood beneath the man, the surface shimmered. For a fleeting moment, Emily saw herself in the water. No longer herself, but something far darker. Her eyes were wide, empty, with a twisted grin carved into her face. It was her, and yet it wasn't. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers returned, louder now, pulsing through the air. Her name over and over. The sound of footsteps, slow but deliberate, echoed around her. She spun around, the feeling of eyes on her relentless. But there was no one. The air grew cold, the whispers intensifying. They were coming from everywhere now, inside her head, around her, beneath her. "You belong here," the voice said, clear and distinct. It was her own voice, but distorted, filled with malice. "No," Emily gasped, her legs weak beneath her. But the words fell on deaf ears. She could feel the ground shifting, the trees closing in around her. The dark forest swallowed her whole, her vision fading with every step. The man in the hat, his body, still and lifeless, was gone, replaced by her own shadow, standing in the clearing, watching her. It was always her. She had never left. She had never escaped. The truth crushed down on her, suffocating her. The darkness closed in tighter, and the whispers became a roar. And in the end, there was only silence. The silence was absolute, a crushing void that swallowed all sound, all sensation. Emily could no longer tell where the ground ended and the air began. Everything felt weightless, suspended in a space that stretched on forever. But then, slowly, a single sound emerged. The quiet crackling of fire. Faint at first, like a distant memory, but growing louder, warmer. A flicker of light appeared ahead, low and flickering like a dying flame. She stepped toward it, her feet moving on their own, as if pulled by the warmth of the fire. The shadows clung to her, dark tendrils reaching from the corners of her vision. She couldn't look away. Her pulse quickened as the light grew brighter, more real. She reached the source, and there it was. A bonfire, roaring in the middle of the void, the flames dancing with unnatural life. And standing around the fire were figures, many of them familiar. The faces of her past, the faces of the shadows she had become. They were watching her, but they weren't like before. These faces, her faces, were alive, full of malice and hunger. They smiled, twisted and cruel, their eyes filled with judgment. She could feel their gaze pressing down on her, suffocating her. One of them stepped forward, another Emily, but not quite. Her grin was wide, too wide, stretched across her face like a mask. "You never escaped," it whispered, the voice crackling like firewood. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, an undeniable force, pulling her toward it. Her feet moved again, drawing her to the fire, to the waiting shadows. "You'll never leave," the voice echoed again. The flames flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows around the figures. They began to circle her, closing in with slow, deliberate steps. Emily felt her heart race, her skin prickling with fear. The air around her grew thick, suffocating. She reached for something, anything, but there was nothing left to grasp. The firelight danced wildly, and the shadows grew darker, colder, more oppressive. And then, the flames flared higher. The shadows reached for her, their hands pulling at her limbs, their whispers clawing at her mind. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fire, by the endless dark. The figures stood over her, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. "You can't outrun yourself," one of them said, its voice a whisper of ashes. Emily's vision blurred, her senses fractured. Everything became distorted, unreal, as if she were floating between worlds. Her own reflection grinned back at her from the fire, its eyes hollow, its smile jagged and cruel. And then, without warning, the fire consumed everything. The flames turned black, curling inward, devouring the last of the light. And Emily, lost within the shadows, disappeared into the nothingness. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and relentless. Emily floated in the void, her mind numb, her body weightless. For a moment, there was no sound, no sensation. Just an endless, oppressive stillness. Then, a flicker of light, a single, weak pulse, cut through the blackness. It was faint, like the dying glow of a star far away. But it was enough. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as they stretched toward the light. It pulled her forward, slowly at first, then faster, like a current dragging her through the darkness. The weightlessness faded, and the ground began to solidify beneath her feet. The air felt different now, cool, fresh, like the first breath after being submerged in water. She opened her eyes. The forest was gone. Instead, there was a vast, empty field stretched out before her, bathed in soft, pale moonlight. The air was still, carrying only the sound of her own breathing. No whispers, no shadows. For a moment, she almost believed it was over, that she had truly escaped. But as she took a step forward, the ground beneath her cracked. She froze, staring down at the fissure that had appeared out of nowhere. From the crack, something began to emerge, something dark and twisted. A figure, a face. It was her face, but it wasn't hers anymore. It was her reflection, twisted and broken, eyes hollow and empty. Her heart clenched as the figure climbed out of the crack, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. The figure raised its head and smiled, a smile too wide, too unsettling. "You never left," it whispered. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the figure moved closer. Emily stumbled back, but the figure followed, relentless, pulling her closer to the crack in the earth. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. But it was too late. The figure lunged forward, grabbing her by the wrists with an iron grip. Her reflection's eyes locked onto hers, deep and black, pulling her into the abyss. "You belong here," it hissed, its voice now a chorus of twisted whispers. And then Emily was falling into darkness, once again. This time, there would be no escape.